by the iconic Rodney Barnes, who's like a true pioneer in the horror space. We were so lucky to be able to collaborate with him, and his show, which sort of delves into terrifying folklore, is just one of a kind. You gotta check it out. So if any of these shows appeal to you, make sure you go check them out by just going to any podcast platform and looking up Ballen Studios, and boom, you'll see all of our shows. Make sure you follow along and tune in each week for new episodes. The members of Neil's exploration group pretty much immediately realized this was a crisis, because not only was Neil stuck in this cave, but in these tight little tunnels underground, there's limited oxygen. So it's not just a matter of, we'll figure it out and get Neil out somehow. It's like, no, you have a limited amount of time before Neil runs out of oxygen. Even if you come up with a solution, it might be too late. And so immediately, members of the exploration group left Peak Cavern to go get help. And before long, over 200 people had flooded the cavern, including a mountain rescue unit and a coal mining extraction team and a whole bunch of civilians.
Damn,
who were all there
over
to try to
200.
figure out how to get Neil out. Now, at first,
At this
Neil
point,
was
drop a
very
rope and y'all
optimistic about
pull.
his recovery. He could hear clearly all the commotion 40 feet above him. He couldn't fully discern what was going on there, but he could clearly tell a major
I'd be
rescue
afraid that
operation
200
afoot.
people
And
would
so
make
as
it
ropes were
collapse.
cast down and ladders were cast down to try to get him out, and they continued to fail, and as the air he was breathing began to thin out and it was getting harder to breathe, Neil's reaction was to kind of be positive. He actually began cracking jokes and calling up like, hey, how much longer do I have to wait down here? But as the minutes turned into hours and none of the efforts by any of the rescuers were working, Neil began to panic. His heart was racing, not only from his nerves, but also because he was running out of oxygen. He had begun to grit his teeth really hard to kind of control his fear. But he was really
When
starting to
switching
lose
out
it.
your
At one
tips,
point, the rescuers threw
let it
down
cool
an
down
oxygen mask for
all
him
the
to
way.
breathe because the air was becoming right on the head, so it's right here. He couldn't get his arms up to put the mask on. And so there it is, salvation, but he couldn't use it. And so before long, Neil sort of began drifting in and out of consciousness. One moment he'd be calling up to his rescuers, asking for an update. The next, they'd call down to him and get no response. Clearly, this situation was becoming dire. Now, to this point, the way the rescue had
Dang,
gone
that
was the
sucks.
rescuers were basically throwing equipment into the hole, be it ladders or ropes or oxygen masks for Neil to grab onto or put on him. And they were hoping that basically Neil could get himself out of the hole. Because the great fear was, if we send a rescuer, or rescuers plural, into this hole to get him, they could get stuck. And now we have an even bigger problem. But when Neil began losing consciousness, when they couldn't get him to call back to them, they
That's
knew
how
they
people
were
treat
genuinely
everybody
running
in
out
their
of time.
30s.
So they began pumping
Here's some help.
oxygen into the hole to hopefully buy
We
some
know.
extra time. And then they decided,
Oh, you can't
gotta
reach
send
it,
someone
but here's
into the
some
hole.
help.
Someone has to go in there, get Neil, and
Do it
pull him out.
yourself.
And so one by one, these courageous rescuers went down into the hole, and 8 times they tried, and 8 times they failed. All 8 either got stuck along the way, or they passed out along the way. 3 people actually reached Neil and actually touched Neil, but there was no way to grab him and pull him out. And so Neil, who was conscious for a lot of this, like he's hearing and literally in some cases seeing rescue. It's right there. It's right in front of him. But it just didn't work. By the time the 8th man was pulled back out of the hole, they could hear in the hole this horrible sound, which was Neil gasping for air. Even though they were attempting to pump air into this hole, it wasn't enough, and Neil just couldn't fill his lungs with enough oxygen. And so the rescuers yelled
his
into the
lungs
hole for
were
Neil to just hold
constricted.
on. They were gonna get him out of there. Just be strong, hold on. But by this point, Neil, he wasn't even saying anything back. He just continued making these awful gasping sounds. By about 7 p.m., when Neil had been stuck in this hole for 4 hours, the rescuers decided to send one more guy into this hole, this really small civilian. And he went down there with a rope to attach around Neil and hopefully pull him out. And this little civilian managed to get all the way down, all the way to Neil. And when he found Neil, Neil was unconscious, but alive. And the rescuer put the rope around Neil's shoulders and then signaled to the surface to begin pulling. And so from the surface, they pulled on this rope, and slowly but surely, Neil began to be pulled out of the hole. And he moved about 18 inches, being monitored by the civilian who was down there. However, because they were pulling so hard on this rope to get Neil to move, the pressure from that rope was basically crushing Neil's chest, and he stopped breathing. And the civilian who was down there with Neil noticed